hi everyone, and welcome to Airtree Stacking the Odds series. I'm Elicia McDonald. I'm an investment partner here at Airtree, and Stacking the Odds is an interview series we're running fortnightly until the end of the year. Besides capital, we know the most valuable thing that an investor can offer a founder is support and advice to improve their odds of success. And so to help with that, we're chatting with people who are masters of their craft. They've done their 10,000 hours and more and are willing to share their expertise with all of us. So rather than you inventing the wheel, their insights will help you hopefully remove some of the guesswork from the company building first and help stack those odds in your startup's favor. So today, as part of this series, I'm thrilled to be joined by Stephanie Carullo to chat all things go-to-market. And, you know, Steph and I have had conversations prior to this session talking about how to nail US go-to-market is top of mind for so many of our local Aussie and Kiwi founders. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Stephanie is an Australian who has spent many years in the Valley as VP sales at Apple, IBM, Cisco, and she's now COO of Box. Before we get stuck into the conversation, just some quick housekeeping. We'll save time for audience Q&A at the end, so please submit questions through the chat feature in the Zoom webinar. And also thanks to everyone who submitted questions ahead of the session. We'll make sure to cover that in the chat today. So without further delay, Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us today. You've had an incredible career so far, starting at IBM in the 90s before you went to Cisco, and then Apple, and now Box. So I'd love to start off with a bit around what drives you and what do you love about working in the technology industry?
Fantastic. Hi, Alicia. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Yes, it's been a 30-plus year career in technology. And, you know, it's interesting. I would say the two things that really attracted me, I fell into tech sort of by accident, but one was just the customer, having the customer at the center of the universe. There was just something about learning about someone's business, and with that, solving for problems, which I love to do. It's one of my most favorite things in the whole world is how do you solve for problems? And so when you marry the two, you have this kind of perfect opportunity within the technology industry. That's what we do every single day, is we try to figure out how to improve on things and deliver on outcomes for everyone. And that's really what I love about it. And every company I've had an opportunity to work for has really sort of opened sort of more and more doors to seeing how the market works across a variety of industries and geographies. And yes, it's been a lot of fun.
And I know I mentioned before around the sort of the diversity of your career in technology, the companies you've worked for, and we've chatted about how some of the core values and leadership of the companies that you've joined have played a big role in terms of the kind of roles that you've taken on. And you've also talked about taking the role at Box because you could see there were some rudimentary sort of foundational things that didn't exist that you knew you could help with to help scale them to a $1 billion+ revenue business. Could you share some of those key things you've built processes around at Box since you started in the COO role?
Yeah, just to provide a little bit of context, one of the advantages of working in the tech industry, and particularly the size of companies, quite candidly, that I had the opportunity to be at, is that you really touched sort of the breadth of the end-to-end motion. And so, you know, I did everything from sales, marketing, operations. I led, you know, a team of 3,000 engineers for a period of time. I worked in professional services, you know, customer success, application development. So when you cover sort of the gamut, you end up sort of picking up a lot of skills along the way. And so, you know, I like to consider myself sort of a utility executive is kind of how I think about it. You should be able to put me into a situation regardless of where I've come from and sort of look at things and then see how we can optimize for something more, you know, improved or better. And one of the things that I noticed at Box, so to give everyone a little bit of history, when I got to Box 5.5 years ago, we were about a $400 million organization. We're about $1 billion this year. And they had done a remarkable job in 8 or 9 years, and they had IPO before I got there, of sort of in a very scrappy way of building a really nice subscription-based business. Aaron Levy, who's the founder and CEO, has this ability and incredible knack and talent of attracting really incredible human beings to come and work there. And we have a bunch of core values, but 2 of them are GSD, get shit done or get stuff done, and the other one is fail fast. And we still, to this day, sort of put our hand on our heart on both. And you know, you've got to be pretty resilient and gritty. And when I got there, they had some processes in place, but they were pretty rudimentary, and they were highly reliant on individuals because he had really created a very talented team of folks, and you just can't scale a business, but on people, you have to have really robust processes. So, and that's kind of what I did all my life. And so we spoke a lot about sort of every aspect of the business, from the fundamentals of forecasting, how we price and package, how we introduce a product to market, segmentation, what does the coverage model look like? And we covered sort of a gamut. And we were walking around a park one day. He said, okay, time out, when can you start? And I said, whenever you want me to. And literally we sort of took function by function, because I cover all non-build, so non-product engineering, everything else pretty much sits under me. And we literally went through anything that was in existence, we sort of reviewed. So we really looked closely at sort of the way we forecast, and all the way to sort of quote through to sort of bill and everything in between. We then looked at our customer success function. We were one of the first SaaS companies to actually create a customer success function. So we were bleeding edge at the time, and we've done a lot of tremendous work with Gainsight and Salesforce. The three of us have really started to sort of show the industry what great customer success could look like. And so we put a whole bunch of process around measuring health and health indicators to drive sort of adoption of your product. What does that look like? We did a big segmentation analysis, and we mapped everything sort of customer journey wise to make sure, okay, how do we think about the customer journey by segment, by geography, because there are huge differences. My clients in Germany look very different to my clients in the Midwest. And so we sort of looked at customer journeys, and we just went through every process, and we've been doing that ever since. And there were some things that didn't exist. So for example, we didn't have a new product introduction model. It's like, okay, we need to have a very clear process with clear DACs and RACs, like who is responsible, who gets consultant, who's the final A. Pricing council, how do you determine a pricing strategy, which is so critically important when you're starting a business, because it's really hard to unwind certain things. You have to be super thoughtful about, a feature versus a product. When do I look at monetizing something? When do I add value intrinsically to a platform? So we covered the gamut, and we've been doing that ever since. So 5.5 years in, and I still have a lot more work to do, but I could honestly say, hand on heart, that we've made things much more robust and scalable. So at $1 billion, we made improvements in 5 years to get us to scale to the billion. And now I'm doing a piece of work that says, okay, we want to scale faster to 2 and 5 billion. Do we have foundationally all of the end-to-end processes in place that would allow us to do that? And then it's just this constant iteration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I feel tired just hearing about how much.
Oh, sorry.
You've started. It's incredible, and I can see why Aaron sort of propositioned you in the past to say, oh, when can you join us? And you sort of touched on a few things. I think talking about Aaron being such an incredible founder, and his ability to bring on amazing talent around him is such a core skill set that we see in a lot of the founders that we back in the broader ecosystem. And also you talked about being scrappy up to 400 million, and obviously that's an incredibly scaled business even at that point to have got to that. And as you continue to scale from there, the processes that you brought in and the way that that's helped the business, there's obviously certain things that need to have process wrapped around it as you operationalize and scale. But you also don't want to over-engineer everything. Yeah. And we've chatted about this. So I'd love you to talk about when that sort of scrappiness, when you can keep that scrappiness, and when it's okay to be scrappy, and how that continues to drive momentum versus when you need to bring those processes in, and how do you differentiate between those circumstances? Yeah,
it's a really good question, because you definitely don't. And we do check ourselves that says, have we made this too complicated? We were in a review last week on just looking at how do we put it into place, and a really streamlined process whereby when we hear out in the market with a client or a prospect, the same sort of theme around something that they really want in the platform that isn't in the platform today. How do I quickly get that to a product manager for review without it having to go through 55 different systems or tools? And we had looked at the first sort of rev of that process, and I said, time out, team, this is like way too complicated. We don't need 15 steps, we need 4. So let's just peel this back. And 2 hours later, we had a new process which had 6 steps in it, not 15, but 6. Pretty clean, very easy, using the existing processes and tools where possible. That's the other thing. We try not to re-engineer too much, and we try not to introduce too many new processes, because otherwise you will get we are a flat organization. That's one of the advantages, that we don't have many layers at all, and we're a very transparent and collaborative organization. What I mean by that is, so we're a very heavy Slack user. Every single person in the entire organization, from Aaron down, and everyone has access to anyone. So we don't have any hierarchy. If you need to speak to the Chief Product Officer, if you're an OBR 2 years out of college and you've got a situation, you Slack Diego and Diego will respond. And if an SMB rep wants Aaron to go out on a call with them for something, Aaron jumps on a call immediately. And that's sort of, we built that into the organization. There's zero hierarchy. We really don't think about titles, and we really think about a flattened organization, because our job is to get the solution to the customer and in the market as fast as possible, and having them use the product. And so we have made sure that we haven't over-engineered anything, and we're still really scrappy. I mean, there are certain things where the decisions are made really quickly. We have a new feature that we're in the middle of sort of the final stages of taking this to market. And product manager has the right to call a meeting to call a no-go or go on when we go public beta. There's a RACI. We follow the RACI or the DACI process pretty religiously. And so the product manager can call it and knows exactly who to call on this. Everyone else gets to look at it, but they don't get a vote. We all know who the voters are. So it's really clean. Sales compensation, there are 4 people who are A's on this, of which I am one. Lots of people might have an opinion, and they may write, we do a lot of annotations on documents together, and so people might make comments, but at the end of the day, everyone knows the dates are scheduled every month, decisions are made, 4 people vote, 30 minutes in and out, minutes are posted, everyone goes. So there's lots of things that are very, very fast. Like Aaron likes to run a really fast organization, so you've got to be able to sort of keep up with him. Having the processes are important, otherwise you'll trip up, but we do move really quickly on the decision making so that we don't waste time. And it's flat. We don't have many layers. So I think that that's super helpful.
Yeah, I think removing bureaucracy and red tape as you scale, and you can sort of maintain the best parts of the startup culture, but add the rigor of a scaled business. It sounds like you found that balance really nicely. I want to talk more about go-to-market. I think that's something that a lot of the founders and operators on the call are keen to dive into. But maybe before we get to the what to do and how to get go-to-market right, we had a pre-submitted question from Matthew before the session, which I was keen to ask you. He asked, what is the most difficult aspect of a go-to-market strategy that founders and operators need to understand in order to be successful? So some of the challenges they come across.
Yeah, so just for context for the folks out there, I'm fortunate enough to mentor and advise a handful of startups and organizations. I've done it for about 6 years now, just for fun, pro bono work mainly. And they've had really fantastic solutions and products. And one of them was 4 people when I started with them. They're 500 now, and they had a really phenomenal product. Straight out of grad school, they had no idea how to go to market. And the thing is, how do you identify the right market? And they'd done a lot of their sort of market segmentation work. And the focus for them was, Steph, should we go after a broader market? Should we sort of focus in and identify specific customers that we could leverage as sort of either a beachhead or a lighthouse? Now, they're in emergency services. They had a very discrete platform, very much for emergency services. And so what we ended up doing was we targeted state and federal governments based on what we knew was an identified problem. And so we did sort of a market plan around just the low-hanging fruit, what were the obvious target audiences, and then within that, who are the right people we should be contacting. We had sort of identified between 3 and 5 individuals that we felt were probably key decision makers and influencers as a result of that solution. And in that instance, got very specific. They landed 2 very, very critical sort of beachhead customers who ended up partnering them sort of through the testing phase, and then became their voice. So they spoke at conferences, and they helped sort of raise awareness in a very, very defined marketplace. And that's a very defined example. Interestingly enough, if I give you the box example, when we started many, many years ago, Aaron came up with this idea. He was interning at a studio in Hollywood, and he was watching writers save things on floppy disks and then driving golf carts across studios to transport this. And he thought, this is bloody ridiculous. Must be a smarter way of doing this. Went back to his hotel that night, wrote some code. I'm not kidding. This is a story. He wrote some code and thought, there's a smarter way of doing this. Aaron's idea was to get this concept of sort of file sync and share and storage out there as fast as possible. So they went with a free model. So it was like, let's go viral. Let's see how many people can bite off on what we know is a fundamental problem for people. People need to file sync, share, and store. Like, it's really basic stuff. And they did some crazy awareness stuff up front, spent a little bit of money. They'd gotten some seed money from Mark Cuban, actually, and they did sort of some viral marketing, but they wanted to go big to see. They knew the market opportunity, there was this vast market opportunity. And you can do some pretty cool things with the freemium model and then start to build on that with a couple of plans. And that was really to understand just how big this market opportunity was. And at the time it was vast, but it was a horizontal, cross-industry, cross-segment play. So you could start with a free single user and then go all the way up to enterprise. And when I look at the original segmentation plans that they did for this, which is really fascinating how they thought, they had tiered the market accordingly, but they really thought about, let's see how broad this could be. And then over the years, what we've done is we've fine-tuned it. So who are our sort of, where's the sweet spot for a small, medium business? Where's the sweet spot for a mid-market, for an enterprise customer? And then for us, like, you have to understand sort of your product market fit. We work extremely well in a regulated industry. So the obvious thing is to have a look at your regulated industries. In our case, it's public sector, it's financial services, it's life sciences and biotech, and then start to identify the most obvious low-hanging fruit use cases, from sort of simple ones to more high value ones. And then you do some market mapping. I mean, it's really methodical. It's not, there's no silver bullet, it's not rocket science, but it absolutely starts to give you a plan and a map to kind of think through the approach. If you've got enough bandwidth, I'm always a big fan. I always say I like to try things in parallel, pivot really quickly. We do a lot of experiments still today. It's the way we sort of run the business. They're all incubated. We run them for very fixed periods of times. We have metrics, we look at them. We want to review today of some e-commerce stuff. 2 of the things didn't work. We've decided in the meeting, we're going to pivot. We will not continue with those. We'll continue with the 3rd one. So you do need to have sort of a model around thinking about how you would sort of test things, if that makes sense. But that market segmentation work is really, really important. And you've got to really think about your product market fit. Like, where is my sweet spot? And that sort of will direct you as to whether you will start sort of narrow, like the emergency services folks did, or whether you go broader. Just hopefully that provides some context.
Yeah, so it sounds like having that plan right from the get-go, but then being open-minded to iterate, experiment, and shift as needed, because obviously you learn a lot through that process, but also the market might shift and the needs of your customers shift over time. So
exactly.
And maybe for the founders and operators on the call, outside of sort of market segmentation, what's the first thing founders should think about when they're trying to figure out their go-to-market strategy, and perhaps particularly with a lens to expanding overseas, so an Aussie or Kiwi founder expanding to the US?
There's sort of probably 3 things. I was writing these down over the weekend because I was kind of thinking about one of the things that's really, really important is having at least a position on a pricing and packaging strategy, because the challenge is, as you're just getting started, there's always this sort of balance between how much do I give away to start with in order to build some momentum within the marketplace. But remember, there are certain decisions that are very hard to go back on from a pricing and packaging perspective. And so I spend a lot of time with the founders as they think about it. Like, I'll say to the founder, so, okay, so what do you think about from a pricing perspective? And they will have done all their research and they sort of laugh and they said, well, you could start really low. And I said, well, why would you do that? Oh, we could go really high. It's like, well, why would you do that? It's like, okay, it's like time out. Let's just take a step back and sort of think through this. And it's really difficult. So having that, like even just having a position, a starting position on what you think about kind of the value and the sort of the monetization strategy around that, I think is really, really important. And going into sort of different markets is kind of how much will someone be prepared to pay for it? I'll give you an example. Even in the United States, there are huge variations between the clients that I deal with here on the West Coast versus potentially maybe someone in the Midwest, someone down south. Their appetite for tech and their propensity to sort of buy technology is going to be very different in terms of being more risk averse. And also just this adoption to the cloud, or the concept of digital transformation, which is a really broad sort of term that's thrown around a lot, but this concept of moving into the modern age and the digital age is really hard for organizations who've been running perfectly fine for 50 years doing it sort of the old-fashioned way. And so we have to be really thoughtful about our approach, and that's where the messaging becomes really important. That's the other thing I would say. So what is your value proposition? There's a core foundational value proposition that should never change. However, it will be slightly nuanced depending on who you're speaking to. So a really great example, when I'm dealing with a higher education institution, because we play very big in education, my conversation with the CIO there or the provost, whoever it may be, is a very different conversation to the customer that I spoke to the day before who's in financial services. It's a very different conversation because I'm addressing very, very different needs and very different understandings of the outcomes and the value that technology will drive. And so understanding, I think being really clear on kind of who your target audience and target market is, the nuances or the variations depending on which markets you go into will make a really big difference. Like in Europe, a really great example, if you're not successful in the UKI, you don't have a foot in Europe. It just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you're doing well in France or in Germany. It makes no difference. You have to have a footprint in the UKI. You just have to materially have to do this. And so everyone always sort of says, well, we'll make some investments, we'll go to the Nordics or we'll go to the dark. It's like, listen, like time out. If you don't have a footprint in the singularly largest market, then you might be wasting your time a little bit. So don't try and spread yourself too thin. Focus, be very, very focused. And I'll give you an example for Box. I have not allowed us to go broad-based across Asia yet. There are so many opportunities that we haven't uncovered in our 9 primary markets that we have not done that yet. And my market, when I look at the TAM, is huge in my 9 sort of select markets. And so every now and then someone will try to convince me, are we ready to go? And I'll say, well, why? Look at how much spend we still have in these other markets. It's always tempting sort of to cover more geographies and to go wider. I would argue that if you understand your markets really well, try and get a very strong foothold in the primary markets where you know you have a value proposition that really extends broadly.
Love that. So it sounds like pricing strategy, having a view on that, again, be iterative as you learn as you go, having that deep understanding of your customer needs and how that changes depending on the customer persona that you're dealing with, and then also not spreading yourself too thin, specifically when it comes to geographical expansion, which is something that a lot of the founders in this region tackle, and how to think about the priority markets.
Yeah, it's hard for the Australians. Yeah, and the New Zealanders, because having spent half my career there, you feel a little detached, although I would argue the last 10 years, the world is very small. But the reality is you're very tempted to say, okay, what markets should I move into? And you sort of naturally think, well, okay, I've got to land in the US, but I think I need to go to Europe as well. And it really does, it takes a toll on you, that just from a bandwidth perspective, and your ability to go deep is much, much harder. So as much as it sounds tempting, just kind of force yourself to really prioritize and focus.
Yeah. And I think it's obvious in the chat that we've had so far that there is no one size fits all when it comes to a go-to-market strategy, but there are methods that you can add to the madness to add some structures and process around that. So I'd love if you could share with our audience some examples of frameworks around that market segmentation that we spoke about, target personas and sales motions that give some structure, but also still allow a startup to pivot quickly and iterate as we've spoken about.
Yeah, so assuming that you've done kind of all of your market analysis, all the traditional stuff, like a lot of this stuff, honestly, it's like anyone that's gone to grad school, it's sort of fundamental things. You really just need to make sure you've done all of that work. And we iterate on our marketing plan every 6 months. So even at $1 billion, we're constantly looking at it. We are, for example, revamping customer journeys right now. And the customer journeys are important because you're trying to figure out, like, who are my personas? And so, for example, we have 4 key personas and we have 4 customer journeys, and we continue to make sure they're the right journeys. Obviously, what you're trying to do is get your product, your offering, your solution into the hands of the customer, into the market as quickly as possible. So you're constantly thinking about kind of what that buying cycle looks like as well. And is there anything I can do to accelerate that? And so as you're starting to think about this, as you get going, there are a lot of different approaches that, you know, I've seen firsthand from anything from a free model, a targeted model, you know, where you're doing proof of concepts or going into trial, then leading to closure, that then become references or testimonials. There's lots of different ways in which you can start to actually get yourself into the market and sort of thinking about those different approaches. And I did that with all the startups that I advise. It's like, okay, so as we get started, what do you want that go-to-market motion to look like? And it'll evolve very quickly. In the case of the emergency services platform, it was very, very targeted, very, very maniacally targeted. We did a whole bunch of work around that. We decided we would do proof of concept to trial to closure super fast. Like, we looked at the number of steps involved and decided that if it took any more than this number of steps, that we should close, like, disqualify out, because we were trying to really get people to bite very quickly. And once we did that, then we actually shifted on the motion and we went much broader. We ended up segmenting key verticals and really started to target very specific subsegments and developed plans around those. And so you're constantly sort of building on and shifting that. The one thing that I have found that early startups tend to forget about is as you're bringing on a handful, like your first set of clients, you need to be thinking about implementation, training, you're going to have to handhold them through this. So for all of the startups, I kind of said, okay, have you written the kind of how to use me handbook? Like, very basic, like, do you have a training module ready to go once you sign up? The first trial becomes a closure. And in many cases, they hadn't thought about that. And it's so critically important to make sure that you're thinking sort of the next step. So, yep, I'm on that sort of selling cycle, but I need to be ready to go to implementation and deployment. Because remember, as you're getting started, you need the customer to use the product as fast as possible. So what are the things that are going to allow you to sort of drive that adoption? And all of the data that I look at, particularly in the SaaS world, you want every user to use your product in the first 7 days of deployment. And then you see it on the graph. The longer it takes, the less likely they will ever use the product. And so what you're trying to do is get people onto the product as quickly as possible. And when you're getting started, you need to have everything ready that enables them to use this, be it either self-serve or training modules, etc. So I always sort of like to remind startups to just make sure you're ready to go, because it's going to happen faster than you think a lot of the time. And so there's a lot of work that is done on that. And then just sort of the messaging as you're going out into the marketplace, there is a clear sort of messaging. What is it? How do you want to be perceived? So as you start to identify kind of your brand and your niche, what does that really look like? Because fundamentally, that really doesn't, you don't want that to change. You want to spend a lot of time thinking about that. And maybe it's as boring as kind of what your mission is. Like, our mission has never changed since Aaron started the company. Our mission is to power how the world works together. He created that when he was 18 years old. He's 36 years old now, and our mission is still to power how the world works together. And it has not fundamentally changed. That was the driving force behind why he created Box. Now, the platform's evolved dramatically. We've added more products and features. We've got more plans. We went from selling single products to actually bundling packages and adding more value. There's a whole raft of things that happen, but fundamentally, the reason he started the company is still the exact same reason today. So I would make sure you think long and hard, like, that you're really comfortable with that message. Like, what is the value that I'm bringing to the market with my product or service or whatever that may be? Because fundamentally, that's going to differentiate you. And then everything else, all your messaging will stem from that and the way you want to be seen by customers. And so that's really important to do as well.
I love that North Star being so enduring over so many years, and that you make all the changes underneath that, but everyone's still moving towards that same goal. And there was a question that came through actually pre-submitted by Steve before the session today around focus. And I think, I've touched on it a little bit. You talked about even at Box, how you incubate ideas and you've got to be iterative after you have these plans. And Steve's question is relevant to that. He asked, how important is focus when you're starting out versus trying a whole bunch of approaches and seeing what works? So how do you strike that balance in terms of knowing when to try different approaches versus stick to what your original plan was?
Yeah, that is a really great question. I would say a few sort of method to the madness statements, and that is, make sure you set yourself some like really clear goals and metrics. Like, you've got to hold yourself accountable, and I'm always a big believer, once you write it down, like, there's no turning back. And so having a very, very clear scorecard around this is what we're setting out to do. These are our objectives. This is what this is the hypothesis that we're trying to prove. This is kind of what we see. And then put a stake in the ground in terms of how long a period of time you think you need to do this for. Look at the metrics religiously, look at the data, watch the data, and you will see in some instances very quickly it either is proving or not proving their hypothesis of what you set out to do. Sometimes it may take a little longer, but you're constantly wanting to measure what it is that you're trying to accomplish in that period of time, and hold yourself true. Like, don't fall into the trap, and we all do. I've seen it at every company, and I've been a part of it, where you say, oh no, let's just wait a little longer. I think I think the market will turn, or I think, we've just got to change the persona. It's going to be fine. That's still our time. And until you get to a point where you have to call it, and that's why you do need to. The data will inform the decisions always. I'm a very, very big data person. And the reality is data doesn't lie ultimately. And so you want to be able to hold yourself accountable and inform the decision by the data. Give yourself enough of sort of a period of time that allows you to do that. And we've gotten really good at holding ourselves accountable and not feeling bad when it doesn't work. This is why one of our core values is fail fast. We learn every time we fail fast. It's a good thing. Failing fast is a really good thing. It is not a bad thing. You learn so much and you take it with you to the next one. And so, but you've got to really hold yourself accountable and measure everything. That's what I would say.
And I think there's actually a lot of parallels in what you're saying there. And also, I'm just thinking some parallels in the local market where I see companies struggle to sell, like a startup struggle to sell a first sort of enterprise contract, but they get paid trials. And when I have these conversations with founders, I'm always like, have you agreed the metrics that you're going to show to the company in terms of that trial? And then if you achieve those, what's actually going to happen? Do they have the budget? Are they going to sign up? And so a lot of parallels in terms of having those agreed up front, tracking them, and then actually going to a next step of action if you actually see that eventuate.
Exactly. And that's a great example, actually, Alicia, in terms of paid trials. Never, ever go down the path of a trial process unless you have a very clear conversion tactic to it. Like, it's the biggest waste of time, as we all know. And so you just have to be super careful about trials. It used to be flavor of the month 15, 20 years ago. And the reality is you want to get, the trial is to get to closure as fast as possible. And again, set the metrics around that, get everyone to jointly agree.
Finite time, very clear.
Yeah.
On both sides before you even get in, because you can see startups suck up a whole lot of their time trying to close this business, and they
exactly
line it from the start.
Well, I'll give you an example. I was reviewing data this afternoon. So we have a free trial and trial to conversion offer online, and we're looking at the data for last quarter. It's up 26% or something. I can't remember what it was, but it was really interesting. We looked at data for maybe the last 8 quarters, and we have consistently seen a very high level of conversions from trials. And this is self-service. This is no touch online self-service, going from trial to closure on low end plans. So, very small, sort of 3 licenses, 5 licenses or 10, but it's really interesting. So you can experiment at a very low cost in a self-service way, online as well. So there's lots of way to do this and gather the data, and then you can tweak that motion online, the whole trial. So we constantly look online at the different steps of the trials to try and shorten those steps to see how quickly can we get the trial to closure. So that's a really great way of experimenting at a very low cost and highly informative, because it's at scale, like the world's your oyster in terms of the marketplace. So that's a really interesting experiment that you can do.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We had a lot of questions submitted beforehand, specifically around Aussie and Kiwi companies expanding their go-to-market, particularly to a market like the US, and the kind of things that they should be thinking about. So I'd love your view on what should be top of mind for an Aussie and Kiwi founder as they tackle expanding to a market like the US. And there's a few sort of follow-up questions that I can dive into a bit more detail.
Yeah, for sure. And I know you had Andrew from Go One on, and they successfully managed to sort of venture into the US market and the European London marketplace, and a number of other startups that I've worked with have done the same. It's interesting. I would argue, having now spent 50% of my career working in tech at home and in Asia, and then 50% here, in terms of the selling differences and nuances directly between ourselves in Australia and the United States, very little. I really feel like the selling motion is a very similar selling motion, which makes it pretty easy for startups to actually go both ways, sort of come in and then come out. The real challenge is, to the earlier question, it might have been Steve's, just the focus and prioritization, because this is a really, really big country with a very big market, and the markets vary, as I said earlier. Sort of doing business, even the cost of doing business is very different depending on which part of the country you're working in. And so when you do your sort of market analysis, market mapping work, competitor profile work, as you do it, it does pay to potentially think about looking at if you look at the United States holistically, and then sort of focusing in on where you may want to start. So for example, depending on the product or service that you have, if it's not a horizontal offering, but actually has some tendencies on particular industries, you can very quickly start to look at that and then potentially zone in on specific parts of the country. So the biotech, for a really great example, there are clear biotech hubs in this country. Massachusetts is one, California and San Diego is another. There's one growing out of Florida. There's one growing out of Detroit. So you kind of know where the hubs are if you've done all your sort of market research, etc. And if that is sort of considered sort of a sweet spot for you, then you would think about potentially focusing in on those markets that make the most sense. If it's a horizontal market, then you really are looking at your total addressable market. Like, look at the TAM and do the analysis by TAM. We do that all the time. And then where the largest TAM is, start there. Trying to cover the entire market is very crazy. So I would probably sort of rethink that as a starting point potentially, but it also depends on the offering. If it's a horizontal offering that applies to everyone, and you've got sort of a pretty sort of digitally inclined way of going to market, then the world's your oyster. You can actually do this. As you start to see sales, you'll start to sort of get a better sense of where you may want to then focus in on. So a lot of it, I think, Elicia, depends on what your product or offering is, and that will sort of inform you as you really do that market mapping exercise. Because in the case of Andrew with Go One, they have a horizontal solution that really applies to everywhere. They made some conscious decisions about coming into sort of this market, so to speak, and sort of basing themselves out of Utah. Utah is a growing hub, as is Boise, Idaho. The sort of cost of doing business is less expensive, and huge talent. That's the other interesting thing that's very different to Australia. The United States has what I would call very specific talent hubs associated with universities. And so, for example, Utah has a number of really compelling institutions like Brigham Young. BYU is a phenomenal university and has an incredible talent pool that comes out of that in very specific areas. And so a lot of organizations tap into the fact that there is a readily available talent pool in a market that's much, much lower cost of doing business. So you sort of see these hubs. Pittsburgh is another one because of the universities there, engineering schools, etc. So what you find is some of these decisions, depending on where you're thinking, how big and how quickly you want to start, you get influenced by a lot of things. And talent, finding talent is probably the number one or number two hardest thing to do in the States. Is we're always fighting for talent, and the cost of doing business varies dramatically. It's much, much more expensive to do business out of California than it is to do it out of Utah, Idaho, or Philly, or anywhere else. And so you do want to take those factors into consideration. And there's a lot, actually, public information, tons of research that's been done that you can access online that's kind of showing you where the sort of talent hubs are bubbling up as a result of larger pools becoming readily available. And most of it is connected to higher education institutions that are sort of feeding these out. And so that's another thing to be thinking about as you come into this market, and thinking about if you want to establish a footprint, like where do I establish myself from the get-go? And talent is kind of in the top two things that you're constantly going to be thinking about, because other than that, I mean, you can literally develop an entire digital program. And that was the other thing COVID taught me as well. And so for the startups, COVID taught us that you can basically do business with anyone from anywhere in the world, and that you can sell whatever it is that you're offering in a digital fashion without any issues at all. And so one of the silver linings, if there's any silver lining from this pandemic, is that it shifted the way we think about doing business dramatically. And that is a fantastic thing for startups. And so there's a lot, because of that mental shift, which is not going to go backwards, I can assure you. And I just read a great article in the Australian Financial Review. I guess David Thodey spoke at something recently talking about this phenomenon of the changing work habits, and they are not going to go back to the old world. That plays to your advantage as a startup. You can try a lot of things right in your own backyard in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or wherever you are, into the US market without anyone even knowing that you're not sitting in the US market. And so don't feel like you're going to have to sort of create a business plan that has you, laying out a ton of expenditure to actually physically be here. What we've seen very clearly over the last 2 years is you can try a lot from home, and touch that market very easily. I still have not seen hardly any customers in real life. I'm doing half a dozen customer calls a week religiously, and have been building great relationships from, I'm going to the office a couple of days a week now, but literally on Zoom. So you can still do a heck of a lot coming into this market without outlaying a ton of money right now. Particularly, I think one of the questions was like, should it make any difference in the current climate? And the reality is, there's not as much money out there in terms of VC money. In terms of the decision-making process for any product or service, people are being much more thoughtful. So you've got to get to explaining your value proposition really quickly. They need to understand how what you're offering is going to add value, and that they need to see a return on that investment. And what does that mean for my business? Probably a little faster than what they would have given people an opportunity to, just because everyone's wanting to make sure that every dollar they spend is going to be worth it. But customers are still spending. I was telling Elicia earlier, there was a Gartner conference last week. The European one is in Barcelona. 7,000 CIOs rocked up to that. And I can assure you they are all still spending money. Now, obviously, there's some obvious sort of investments they have to, with the cyber threats. So security is like top of mind for everyone. But they're looking at their investments in their products and technologies or whatever it may be and saying, okay, how do I optimize for this? And what's the most important thing that I need for my organization to be successful? And they will still make investments. So I don't, even if the situation, the market conditions get a little worse, and personally, I think they're going to be pretty tough for the next 6 to 9 months before they stabilize, is sort of my personal reading of the situation. People are still going to make investments in the things that are most important to them. So it'll slow things down a fraction because things will get a little more scrutiny. So the selling cycles may take a little bit longer. So be very thoughtful about each step of that motion and be very, very clear and make sure you ask the question, does this address everything you need? Have we hit the milestone as expected? Do we, so that you can keep the ball moving forward. You just have to be just a little bit more disciplined around the process because everyone's just going to be looking at things a lot more closely.
And I want to spend a little bit more time on the talent piece. You sort of mentioned it in terms of where you would set up a hub, but then also COVID breaking down barriers in terms of business getting done over Zoom. So there are definitely things that you can do from Australia and still sell into the US. Yeah. I think some of the questions that we had submitted, I think Henry sent one through before the session around hiring US-based people and whether the sales cultures differ. I know you talked about sales motions are very similar, but the cultural difference between the Australians and Americans, and whether when you get to that point, let's say you've experimented a bit, you've done some founder-led sales over Zoom, when you want to start to put boots on the ground, how important is it to have locals, have local networks, you can tap into their network, and less of a cultural difference versus potentially continuing with founder-led sales on one of the founders, which is typically a conversation that always comes up here. Should one of the founders relocate to the US? So I'd love to pick your brains on what you've seen work well around this kind of decision.
This is Steph's view of the world, but what I've seen as a general statement, you need locals as part of your core team. Look, they understand the market better. They'll have local experience. There's a whole variety of reasons why you need to hire locally. In saying that, though, culture is critically important. And so, I would encourage founders to absolutely, in the initial stages, as you're creating your teams, you have to personally handpick them, because ultimately you're the reason why they will want to join anyway. Like it's your idea, it's your passion, it's your vision, it's your mission. And so the founders should be, I honestly believe, well, for Aaron still to this day gets involved in our director level and above hiring, which is kind of insane, but he loves to meet people and people love to meet him. And so it's sort of a joy for him. But I would argue founders should be hiring personally, like hire the local talent, because you need to be able to go into the market. So if you come into this market and identify really carefully the individuals that will align with the culture that you want to create, and you will have created a culture at home, and you want that same culture to continue to sort of grow and nurture as a global culture. So you want to be handpicking them. If you can relocate for a period of time, it's highly advantageous. I know it's hard to do sometimes. So if you can't do that, coming in and out regularly and finding sort of someone that immediately you can trust to sort of lead the small teams, because you start pretty small, but you do want to personally handpick your first few employees. It's critically important that you get off on the right footing and off on the right sort of trajectory from the get-go, because it's really, really hard to come back from there. So I do personally feel like founders have to be involved. I would argue founders are involved in hiring for, first 100, if you ask me, at least. As I said, we're 2,500 people, and Aaron loves to know, I give him a hiring update at the end of every week. He kind of likes to know who we're talking to, what's the market look like, what are we seeing, what are the hot skills, what should we be worrying about? And the culture is important. Like, we are a remarkable company, I would argue, because he's built this amazing culture, and I know that. And every time I speak to someone, so I'll give you an example. Our head in Europe was a senior executive, ran a big chunk of Google for about a decade, and has come and sort of leading our operation. And he talks about how amazing. He said, "Yeah, you told me, you sold me on the culture," and I sort of believed it, sort of haphazardly, got it, yeah, right. And he said, every day I sort of think, wow, you understated how incredible this culture is. And we hear that constantly, I hear that on a daily basis. We hired a lot of people during the pandemic, and some of them are just starting to meet each other in person for the first time now. And they said, this is a really special culture. And, I say to Aaron, that's you. This is a testament to you. I tell a funny story. 6 weeks after I joined, we had our global customer conference, and I was interviewing someone out of the Obama administration. It was kind of a fun thing for our Box Women's Network. We have really big sort of resource community groups. And this woman jumped out of the front seat at the end of this, like there were 1,000 people in the hall. I'm coming off the stage, and this woman jumps off and she gives me a bear hug. And my husband's saying, who, like he's back at the room saying, who is that? I'm thinking, I have no idea. And it was Aaron's mother. It clicked to me as she hugged me. I thought to myself, this is Aaron Levy's mother. And I stepped back and I said, you're Aaron's mother, aren't you? She said, yes, Aaron, so excited to have you here. It's like, and I thought to myself, and I said to her, I'd been there 6 weeks, and I said, don't tell your son, but I'd take a bullet for him. And that is how I felt 6 weeks into the job. 5.5 years later, I would still say exactly the same thing. And I think every employee will tell you that's why they're here. So this culture piece, it's magic. Mm-hmm. Like you can be really small but mighty, and that's kind of what we are. If I think about the fact that we haven't grown that many employees, and since I've been here, we've doubled the business. We're at $1 billion. We're still just over 2,000 employees. We are fast and we're agile and we make quick decisions. And we don't get them right every time. We know that. And, we've gone through some interesting times over the last couple of years, but we have each other's backs. We do the right thing for the customer, for each other, for the community at large. And that is culture. And Aaron built this culture. He wears it on his sleeve, and we do as well. And so as a founder, it is the most important thing. If there's one thing I'll leave you with today, the most important thing is create the organization that you've always wanted to. Hire the best possible people and personally handpick them, because ultimately that's what's going to separate you at the end of the day. The customers who say to me on a daily basis, your teams are amazing. And they deal with every other major SaaS player out there. But the fact they tell us over and over again. And then, Glassdoor, 94% of Box employees would recommend anyone to work at Box. Aaron has a 95% rating, I think the second highest on Glassdoor. And it's important. It'll see you through the hard times. Quite frankly, that's the other thing to think about. As you're getting started, it's hard. It's really hard. It's going to be scrappy. The things that you have to focus on is, being resilient and gritty. I think they're two of the most important characteristics to have in life in general. But as a professional, resiliency and grit is so important. When you surround yourself with great human beings who are smart and work hard, you create magic. And so just remember that. So definitely handpick your people.
And I think we see a lot of the best founders obsessing over culture. I think you talk about the importance of creating culture, but it's really incredible to maintain that as you scale, and at the scale that you're at, over $1 billion of revenue, and still being able to maintain that sort of that magic of your culture is incredibly special, and obviously a testament to the business that Aaron has built and maintained as you've grown. I think particularly if we link that back to sort of expanding into the US, it sounds like if you have, like you mentioned, it's not always possible, but if you have the possibility of having a founder relocate for a period of time, handpick that talent, you can replicate that culture and you can be there and live it and breathe it and see it and feel it, and it makes it easier as you're building out a whole new geography. There was a question that I want to try and squeeze in before we finish from Naveen that was submitted before the discussion today, which was around signals you seek on why your successful go-to-market model isn't working. So let's say you expand into the US and it's just not working. So what are the signs? And I think particularly that's something that we see come up quite a bit is if you do get that first VP sales or head of sales in the US wrong, how long do you give? There's obviously ramp times, different markets, it takes time, but when do you know those metrics that you were talking about before, when you know it's time to pivot or to reassess the way that you're approaching something? And it feels like something that's a question we get a lot.
Yeah, it's a really tough one. One of the things that the founders hate to do is give up really quickly at first. So if, for example, you hire a VP of sales and it just isn't working, you have to have the courage to bite the bullet pretty quickly, because quite candidly, if you have a good plan in terms of the approach that you've decided on what that go-to-market motion is, if it's either very focused and you're going to go after a small number of accounts and you're going to sort of do proof of concepts and you're going to sign, like if you have a really clear plan, you should be able to set a time frame around that. And therefore, if you've hired a VP of sales and you've got a small team on the ground, quite candidly, you should be able to measure yourself against that plan. And if the idea is, and we set ourselves metrics all the time. So if you're saying, well, in the first 30 days, this is what top of funnel should look like. We think it's going to take us so long to actually sort of land, 10 qualified opportunities, and then you take this through. Like, be fair and just give yourself enough time to actually go through that process. But you do need to set some clear milestones with whoever you're hiring in order to accomplish that. Also, you're going to start to get really interesting feedback from customer engagements. And that's the other thing. What you will find is, in the first instance, the founders should be making those customer calls. Even if you're hiring someone on the ground, you would be, for the first, 30, 60 days, you're going to be actually calling together anyway. So you're going to sort of get a sense for whether you made the right judgment or not. And so you're looking for those sorts of signs. You want to go a step back, and so you want to be scrutinizing sort of the talent as you're hiring them, because this is the other thing. There are lots of VP of sales out there, but most have never worked in a business from sort of ground up. So startups are very, very different. They're not well established. And so you want to be looking carefully at their resumes. If the individual has only really ever worked in a very well established organization, their ability to take something brand new and sell it is going to be a lot harder. So you probably do want to be scrutinizing that pretty quickly, but you want to sort of pull the plug on these things sooner rather than later. The startup here that I support made a tough decision on a very, very senior exec, and there were just telltale signs, everything from missed milestones, internal feedback from the small teams, and that's a bad sign. It goes back to the culture piece. If you're seeing, friction or tension in the first few months, that's already sort of a misalignment. And you think, as you're building a small team, that shouldn't exist at all. So you're sort of watching for that. You're watching sort of for customer and market feedback. They're going to be getting in front of some investors. Again, what does that interaction look like? So there's probably 4 or 5 key areas that you can sort of just document for yourself and say, these are the 5 key areas that I'm going to be looking out for, and these are sort of 3 things that I'll watch for in each of these, and very quickly sort of make that decision. In terms of sort of the product or offering service as you go into the market, and if it's not getting traction, I always say hit the pause button and kind of do a reset. We do this all the time, honestly, at every company I've ever been at, but especially here at Box, where we thought we were on the right path. We developed a feature, we did all the work up front, and then we took it into the market and it just didn't get traction. And so, we do a lot of sort of introspective sort of looking at like what went wrong, and looked at the data and sort of pull back the onion layers. And then we either pivot in terms of, okay, maybe we misunderstood the size of the market or who we were targeting. And if we feel like that, after sort of revisiting, there is still clearly a market opportunity, but we either sort of didn't target correctly, priced it incorrectly. There may be a variety of reasons, didn't bundle it. We may pivot and try something else before sort of cutting the cord and say, no, we'll walk away. We have done that. We have absolutely made tough decisions that says this isn't working, and you sort of have to be bold enough. But I think before you get to that stage, particularly when you're a startup and it's a new market entry, there's lots of ways to go back. Just go back and revisit the strategic plan and the marketing plan. Look at the market analysis that you've done. Did you miss a major competitor in the process? Like, was there someone that you just completely overlooked that actually had a value proposition that overlapped with yours? And so do you have to go back and revisit that value proposition? Have you got the right use cases? Maybe you were targeting the wrong use cases. So there's lots of things that you can do to explore, to sort of tweak things and try things. As you're getting started, you get the opportunity to run parallel paths, and make those decisions without having to call it. That's our experience. We never give up first time. Like, we actually go back and say, okay, what did we miss? And then we'll try something else. We give ourselves a defined period of time, and I would encourage you to do that.
Awesome. I think that's a great note to finish on, Stephanie. You've been so generous with your time, and thank you for sharing all your wisdom as part of this Stacking the Odds series. And I know you also take time, as you mentioned, to advise a lot of startups, both in the US, but also local Aussie and Kiwi founders who are looking to expand globally. So really appreciate all your insights, and thank you very much for your time. It's been awesome to learn
Yeah,
from.
thank you. It's been fun. Thanks so much. And good luck to everyone out there. Super excited for all of you, and the world's your oyster.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Bye-bye.